Some children grow up with parents. Others grow up learning how to survive, not because they wanted to, but because no one else was really there. Maybe you were the child who handled problems alone, who figured things out without asking for help, who learned very early that crying didn't change anything. So you stopped asking, you stopped expecting, and slowly, without realizing it, you became the one raising yourself. But here's the strange part. Those children often grow into adults who look incredibly strong, independent, responsible, mature. Yet inside, something still feels unfinished. A quiet loneliness, a feeling that you've always been on your own. If this feels familiar, there's a reason for it, and it usually begins much earlier than people realize. When people imagine childhood neglect, they often picture extreme situations, abandonment, violence, obvious suffering. But emotional neglect is quieter than that, much quieter. Sometimes it looks like parents who provided food, shelter, and education, but not presence. Parents who were physically there, but emotionally somewhere else, busy with work, consumed by their own struggles, or simply unaware of what their child needed. So the child adapts. They learn not to bother anyone. They learn to solve their own problems. They learn to hide emotions that no one seems interested in understanding. And little by little, they become the adult in the room, even when they're still a child. Maybe you remember moments like this. You were upset, but told yourself it wasn't a big deal. You needed comfort, but convinced yourself you were being dramatic. You had questions, but kept them to yourself. Because somewhere along the way, you learned something powerful. No one is coming to help. Not necessarily because your parents were bad people. Sometimes they were simply overwhelmed. Sometimes they grew up the same way. But the child doesn't understand that. The child only feels the absence. And when emotional needs aren't met, the brain does something fascinating. It starts building independence much earlier than it should. On the surface, that sounds like a good thing. But independence born from loneliness carries a hidden cost. Pause for a moment and think about this. When you were a child, who helped you understand your emotions? Who showed you how to process sadness, anger, fear? For many people who raise themselves, the answer is no one. So they became experts at something else, suppressing, minimizing, overthinking, trying to solve feelings like they were math problems. This is why many adults who raise themselves develop certain patterns. They struggle to ask for help, even when they desperately need it. They feel uncomfortable depending on others, even in close relationships. They're often the reliable one, the responsible one, the one everyone else leans on. But when they need someone to lean on, they hesitate, because deep down, their brain still believes the same childhood rule: you're on your own. And here's where it gets even more complicated. People who raise themselves often appear extremely capable. They're the friend who gives great advice, the coworker who handles everything calmly, the partner who seems emotionally strong. But strength can sometimes be a disguise, because what looks like strength can actually be emotional self-protection. When you grow up learning that your feelings won't be held, you stop offering them. Think about this moment honestly. How easy is it for you to tell someone when you're struggling? Not joking about it, not downplaying it, actually saying, "I'm not okay." For many people who raise themselves, those three words feel strangely difficult, because vulnerability was never modeled. So the brain learned a different strategy: handle it alone. But here's something important. Children who raise themselves often become incredibly perceptive adults. They read people well. They sense tension quickly. They notice emotional shifts others miss. Because growing up, they had to. When you're a child in an emotionally unpredictable environment, your brain becomes a scanner, always paying attention, always preparing, always thinking two steps ahead.
This is one reason many overthinkers come from these backgrounds. Their minds learned early that awareness equals safety. But there's a hidden emotional paradox here. The child who learned to survive alone often grows into the adult who secretly longs for someone to finally see them. Not their achievements, not their independence, but them, their fears, their exhaustion, their quiet sadness, the part of them that never got to be a child. Pause for a moment and reflect. Were you the responsible child? The mature one? The one adults described as so independent for your age? It might have sounded like a compliment, but sometimes it meant something else. It meant you didn't have the space to simply be a child. And this creates an interesting twist in adulthood. People who raise themselves often attract others who need taken care of. Friends with problems, partners who rely on them heavily, people who need emotional support, because that role feels familiar. Caretaker, problem solver, the strong one. But deep down, there's often a quiet question they rarely say out loud. Who takes care of me? And here's the realization many people eventually come to. Raising yourself teaches survival, but it doesn't always teach connection. It teaches independence, but not always emotional safety. And that's why adulthood can feel confusing, because part of you is extremely capable, while another part still carries the loneliness of that child. But something important happens when you finally understand this pattern. You stop blaming yourself. You stop wondering why asking for help feels uncomfortable, why vulnerability feels risky, why independence sometimes feels exhausting. You realize something simple but powerful. You didn't become this way by accident. You adapted. You survived. You built strength in the only way you knew how. But here's the truth that many people discover later in life. Just because you had to raise yourself doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone. Learning to let people in, learning to ask for support, learning that your emotions deserve space too, that's not weakness. It's something many self-raised adults are learning for the first time. And it takes courage, a different kind of courage than the one you learned as a child. Because the strongest thing a self-raised adult can do is slowly unlearn the belief that they're always on their own. And maybe this is the moment where that shift begins, where you recognize something about yourself. Not brokenness, not weakness, but resilience. The quiet kind. The kind that carried you through years without guidance, without reassurance, without someone explaining how emotions work. You figured it out anyway. You kept going. You built a life from pieces you had to assemble yourself. And that says something powerful about who you are. But it also means something else. You deserve the kind of support you never had, the kind of understanding you once needed. And the moment you start giving yourself that is the moment the child who raised themselves finally stops feeling alone.